It was a bright, warm afternoon when a young black man walked into the dealership, his steps calm and measured. He wasn't dressed in anything special, just a simple hoodie and jeans, with a pair of sunglasses perched on his face. To the casual observer, he might have seemed like just another person looking to buy a car, but there was something about him that set him apart. He moved with confidence, like someone who knew exactly where they were going and what they wanted. Little did the salesman know, he was about to make a huge mistake. The salesman, behind the counter, was a middle-aged man with a look that could be described as smug. He wore a crisp, expensive suit and had a tone that suggested he thought he was better than most people who walked into his showroom. As soon as his eyes landed on the young man, he gave him a quick once-over, his gaze lingering slightly too long on the man's appearance. The salesman immediately assumed that this man was someone who couldn't afford anything in the high-end dealership. "Good afternoon," the salesman said with a forced smile, his tone colder than he intended. "Can I help you, sir?" The young man smiled back, but it wasn't a warm smile. There was a hint of something deeper in his eyes, something the salesman didn't catch. He simply nodded and gestured toward the expensive cars parked in the showroom. "I'm just looking for a car," he replied, his voice calm, almost neutral. The salesman couldn't help but size him up. He was sure that this young man wouldn't be able to afford the high-end models they sold. Maybe he was just browsing, maybe looking for something used. Either way, the salesman wasn't about to waste too much time on him. "You should check out the latest models," the salesman said with a touch of arrogance. "They're sleek, fast, and come with all the luxury features you could want. Of course, they're on the higher end of the price range." The young man's expression didn't change, but the salesman thought he saw a flicker of something. Maybe confusion, maybe frustration. It was hard to tell. Still, he continued with his pitch, his words full of pride. He showed the young man several top-of-the-line vehicles, speaking as though the man couldn't possibly have the money to afford any of them. As he spoke, the salesman didn't realize that his assumptions were turning into something worse. The young man didn't respond to the pushy sales tactics, nor did he show any sign of irritation. Instead, he simply listened, nodding when appropriate, but not engaging much beyond that. The salesman took that as a sign of disinterest and pushed a little harder. "Most people who come in here looking for cars like these know exactly what they want," the salesman said, now trying to press his advantage. "But you have to know that these kinds of cars aren't for everyone. You get what you pay for, after all." The words stung a little, but the young man didn't react. He only stood there, his eyes scanning the cars, and when he turned back toward the salesman, there was no anger in his expression. Instead, he gave a soft nod, almost like he was humoring the salesman. But inside, things were different. The young man wasn't there to buy a car at all. He had another purpose, something far bigger than simply purchasing a new vehicle. As the salesman continued to talk, he couldn't help but feel a sense of superiority, not realizing that he was about to find out just how wrong he was. The young man's cool, composed demeanor hid the power and influence that came with his real identity, something that was about to come crashing down on the arrogant salesman. And so, the encounter began, small, ordinary on the surface, but with an undercurrent of tension that neither of them fully understood at the time. The salesman, not fully aware of the tension growing between them, continued his pitch with increasing enthusiasm. His words flowed smoothly, but there was an edge to them now. He was no longer just offering cars. He was making judgments, assumptions that would soon come back to haunt him. "Of course, with a car like this, you're not just buying a vehicle," the salesman said, gesturing to a shiny, expensive model. "You're buying status. People will know you have taste. Only a select few can afford these. It's not for the faint of heart, you know. A car like this takes a certain kind of person." The young man gave no reply. He was silent, his eyes focused, scanning the car's features. But he didn't seem impressed. He wasn't really there for the car. It was clear by now that this wasn't about luxury for him. But the salesman, oblivious to the man's true purpose, kept pushing harder, thinking he was dealing with someone who needed to be sold on the idea of luxury. "You know," the salesman continued, lowering his voice a little as if sharing a secret, "a lot of people buy these cars just to impress others. They're looking for respect. But you and I both know, respect doesn't come from a car. It comes from who you are." He paused, studying the young man's reaction. Still, the young man didn't speak. He only nodded slightly, almost as if he were acknowledging the salesman's attempt to relate. His calmness, his stoic silence, seemed to annoy the salesman even more. A small grin spread across the salesman's face as he felt in control of the situation. "I get it, you know," he said, now talking in a condescending manner. "It's easy to come in here and pretend you belong. But let's be honest, you probably don't have the kind of money for these kinds of cars, do you?" There was a shift in the air. The young man's eyes flickered for a moment, but he said nothing. Instead, he slowly turned his attention to another vehicle, showing no sign of anger or frustration, just a quiet acceptance of the salesman's assumptions. It was as though the young man had heard it all before, people constantly judging him based on his appearance, based on what they thought they knew. The salesman, still oblivious to who he was truly speaking to, thought the silence was a sign of discomfort. So he pressed on with even more force. "It's all right," he continued, almost mocking. "Some people come in here, see the prices, and they get overwhelmed. You have to have a certain kind of life to afford this kind of luxury, and I don't think you have that life. Maybe just take a look at the used cars, you know, something more within your range." The young man stood still, his face unreadable. His hands stayed relaxed by his sides as the salesman rambled on, oblivious to the growing tension. He didn't snap, didn't get angry. He simply kept his cool, allowing the salesman to dig himself into a deeper hole with every word. The young man wasn't in a rush. He didn't need to explain himself, to get upset. He knew that there was no point in trying to argue with someone who already thought they had it all figured out. And then, as if to punctuate his growing annoyance, the salesman made a careless mistake that would cost him far more than he could ever have imagined. The salesman, feeling overly confident now, suddenly reached out and gave the young man a quick slap across the arm. He thought it was a harmless gesture, maybe to get the man's attention, but what he didn't realize was that this action would change everything. As the slap landed, the room went quiet. The young man's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't show a hint of surprise. But the silence in the room grew as others in the showroom stopped what they were doing, their eyes darting between the salesman and the young man. The slap had been a careless move, but it would soon turn out to be one of the biggest mistakes the salesman would ever make. The tension in the air was palpable. The black man didn't react at first, but the room sensed that something serious was about to unfold. The slap echoed through the showroom, its sharp sound almost too loud in the sudden silence. For a moment, it seemed as though the whole room held its breath, waiting for the young man to react. But he didn't. He simply stood there, unmoving. His face was calm, almost unreadable. The salesman, on the other hand, stood frozen, his hand still raised in the air, as if unsure of what to do next. The room felt tense now, with everyone unsure of what would happen next. Some of the customers exchanged nervous glances, their faces a mix of confusion and anxiety. The employees behind the counter, including the manager, were watching closely, but no one dared to speak. The salesman had clearly crossed a line, but would he face the consequences? For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the young man finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his words measured but firm. The salesman blinked, his face pale now, and the confident air that had surrounded him moments before was gone. He had miscalculated. He had no idea who this man was. He had assumed, based on the young man's clothes, his relaxed demeanor, and his silence, that he was just another customer who wouldn't make a fuss. But now he realized how wrong he had been. The young man didn't raise his voice, didn't shout. There was no anger in his eyes, just a calm that seemed to make the salesman feel even more uncomfortable. It was as if he was standing before someone far more powerful than he could ever have imagined, and he had no idea how to fix the situation he had created. The black man slowly turned around, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the faces of the people who were now watching the scene unfold. His calmness was unnerving to the salesman, who could feel his heart rate quicken. Was he going to be punished right here, in front of everyone? Was there something about this man that he didn't understand? The young man's gaze locked onto the manager, who was standing at the back, watching the situation closely. The manager knew immediately that the atmosphere had shifted. He could feel the change, the tension in the air. He swallowed hard, suddenly realizing that he was witnessing something that could spiral out of control if not handled carefully. Still, the young man didn't react with violence. He didn't lash out. Instead, he simply took a deep breath and stepped a little closer to the salesman. "You have no idea who I am," the young man said, his voice steady. He didn't say it with anger or aggression, just a simple statement of fact. It was like he was pointing out an obvious truth that the salesman had missed. For a moment, the salesman felt a flicker of confusion. He was sure he had made a mistake. But who was this guy? Why wasn't he showing the typical signs of someone who would react with anger or even violence? He had expected the black man to shout or demand an apology. But instead, the young man was just standing there, his calm presence almost more terrifying than if he had raised his voice. As the salesman tried to figure out what to say, the black man didn't give him the chance. Instead, he casually removed his jacket. The action was simple, almost casual, but it spoke volumes. As he did, the fabric of his shirt shifted slightly, and for the first time, the salesman noticed something, a tattoo on the man's arm, a symbol that he immediately recognized. It wasn't just any tattoo. The symbol was one that was known in certain circles of the city. It was a symbol associated with power, fear, and respect. The salesman's eyes widened in realization as the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. This wasn't just some random customer. This man, who he had so casually insulted, was the leader of one of the most feared gangs in the city. The weight of the situation hit him all at once. His face turned even paler as his mind raced, trying to come to terms with the mistake he had made. He had slapped the leader of one of the most dangerous groups in the city, and he had no idea how to get out of it. The room was dead silent. Every eye in the showroom was on the young man now, watching him with a mix of awe, fear, and disbelief. No one dared to speak. The young man didn't make a scene. He didn't yell. He simply stood there, waiting for the salesman to make the next move, fully aware of the power he held in that moment. The salesman, for the first time, was the one who felt powerless. The salesman was frozen, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The young man's calm demeanor and the symbol on his arm were enough to make his heart pound in his chest. He had been so sure of himself, so sure that he was in control. But now, everything had changed in an instant. The arrogance that had defined him just moments ago felt like a distant memory. The young man stood silently, his eyes never leaving the salesman, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. It was as though the young man wasn't just standing there in the showroom. He was towering over the salesman in that moment. His presence seemed to fill the entire room, and the salesman couldn't help but feel small in comparison. The power dynamic had shifted, and there was no turning back now. "Do you realize what you've done?" the young man asked, his voice low and calm, but every word carrying the weight of a heavy truth. The salesman's hands trembled slightly as he tried to form a response, but his mind was a blur. He had no idea who this man was, at least not until now. The realization hit him like a freight train. The black man wasn't just a random customer. He was someone far more important than he could have ever imagined. I didn't know," the salesman stammered, his voice quivering with a mixture of fear and guilt. His face had turned pale, his earlier smugness replaced by a look of panic. He had slapped the wrong person, and now he was fully aware that there would be consequences. But what could he do? How could he get out of this? The young man remained silent, allowing the salesman to fumble with his words, but saying nothing in response. The calmness in his eyes was almost unsettling, like he was waiting for the salesman to understand the gravity of the situation on his own. The manager, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, finally stepped forward, his own anxiety written all over his face. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, trying to maintain some level of control, though he could see the shift in power. He was no fool. He knew something serious was happening, and the tension in the air was unmistakable. The young man turned his gaze toward the manager, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, without saying a word, the young man looked back at the salesman, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though assessing whether the man would continue to make excuses or face the reality of his actions. "I don't want your apology," the young man finally said, his voice as cool and composed as ever. "It's too late for that now. But you need to understand something. Respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you have to earn. And you've already shown me what kind of person you really are." The salesman's face flushed, and his shoulders sagged as the full weight of the words sank in. He had made a mistake, one he couldn't take back. And in that moment, he realized just how badly he had misjudged the situation. What he had thought was an ordinary encounter had turned into something much bigger than he could handle. The young man stepped back slightly, and his gaze shifted toward the door. It wasn't a threatening move, but it was a reminder that he could walk away from the situation at any time. He had all the power in this room now, and the salesman knew it. There was nothing he could say or do to change the outcome. "You're lucky I'm not someone who makes a scene," the young man added, his voice still calm, but carrying a sharp edge. "But I don't forget things like this. You've made your choice." The room remained eerily quiet. The manager was unsure whether to step in or let the situation play out, but he knew better than to interfere. The young man had made it clear that he wasn't interested in violence or confrontation. He simply wanted the salesman to understand the consequences of his actions. Without saying another word, the young man turned and began walking toward the exit. His steps were steady, and there was no rush, no sense of urgency. But everyone in the showroom knew that things had changed. The young man had made his point, and the salesman would have to live with the weight of his mistake. As the door closed behind him, the room slowly came back to life. But the atmosphere was different now. The salesman stood there, still shaken, while the others exchanged glances, unsure of what had just happened. But one thing was clear: the young man's power, his calmness, and his control had left a lasting impression on everyone in that room. The atmosphere in the showroom remained heavy after the young man left. The silence that followed his departure seemed to stretch on forever, as if the very air had thickened with the tension of the moment. The salesman stood there, his face flushed with a mix of panic and disbelief. His hands, still trembling slightly, were gripping the edge of the counter as though it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. He had never imagined that his casual, arrogant attitude would lead to something like this. In his mind, he had just been doing his job, trying to sell a car. But now, he was facing the terrifying reality that he had crossed a line. He had slapped a man he didn't even know, a man who now seemed to be someone far more important than he could have ever guessed. The manager, still standing at the back of the showroom, was watching the salesman carefully, unsure of what to do. The unease in the room was palpable. Everyone could feel it. They all knew the young man hadn't caused a scene or made a scene. He had simply walked out, leaving the salesman to stew in his own regret. But what did that mean? What would happen next? The manager cleared his throat and stepped forward, trying to break the silence that seemed to have settled over them all. "Look, just take a seat for a minute. We'll figure this out." His voice was soft, but there was no hiding the concern in his eyes. He knew this was a serious situation, but there was nothing he could do to undo what had happened. The salesman didn't move at first, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. He had no idea who the young man was, but now he couldn't stop thinking about those tattoos, the unmistakable signs of power and authority. That symbol wasn't just a random design. It meant something, something that struck fear into people's hearts. He had heard the rumors before, but he never imagined they would come to life in front of him. He never thought he'd find himself on the receiving end of it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the salesman took a deep breath and sat down. His legs were weak, and his hands still trembled slightly as he placed them on his lap. The reality of what had just happened hit him harder than he expected. He had been so sure of himself, so confident, but now that confidence felt like a distant memory. "I messed up," the salesman muttered under his breath, barely able to hear his own words. His voice was hoarse, and there was no denying the guilt that weighed heavily on his shoulders. "I didn't know who he was." The manager nodded, his face serious but understanding. He had been in this business long enough to know that sometimes people got too comfortable, thinking they could treat others however they wanted. But he also knew that there were lines you didn't cross. And this was one of those lines. "I'm going to make sure we handle this carefully," the manager said, his tone firm but calm. "You need to go speak to the owner as soon as possible. We can't just let this slide." The salesman nodded, still too stunned to say much more. The truth was, he didn't know how to fix the situation. The damage was done. He had insulted someone important, and now there was no going back. The fear was starting to set in, creeping into his thoughts. What would happen to him now? Would there be consequences? And if so, what would they look like? Outside the showroom, the young man had walked out without a second glance. His steps were steady and sure, unaffected by the turmoil he had just left behind. He wasn't looking for revenge, nor was he seeking to escalate the situation. He had simply made a point. And for him, that was enough. The world outside seemed the same as it had when he had first entered, but he knew that the impact of what had just happened would linger, at least for a while. The salesman had learned a lesson, one that he would never forget. And though the young man hadn't needed to raise his voice or make threats, his actions had spoken louder than anything else could have. The salesman, meanwhile, sat in the showroom, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him more with each passing second. He had just learned the hard way that respect isn't something you can force. It's something you earn. And that was something he would have to live with for the rest of his life. The minutes ticked by slowly in the dealership, but for the salesman, time felt like it had come to a standstill. The weight of what had happened seemed to grow heavier with every second. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how to make things right, but every idea he came up with felt inadequate. Nothing would change what had just occurred. Outside the showroom, the young man had walked away, his presence still lingering in the air. The salesman couldn't shake the image of his calm, unwavering demeanor. The way the young man had stood there, not reacting with anger or threats, made the whole situation feel more intense than if there had been a loud confrontation. It was as if the young man had some quiet power, something the salesman could never fully understand. Inside, the manager stood behind the counter, observing the salesman, who was now visibly shaken. The room had a tense, almost oppressive feeling. The employees, who had witnessed the entire exchange, were still trying to process what had just happened. They all knew the young man's presence had changed everything. But what did it mean for the future of the dealership? No one had answers yet, and the uncertainty made the air feel even thicker. The salesman, now standing up, glanced over at the manager, his face pale and drawn. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice weak and uncertain. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know." The manager sighed deeply, his face reflecting the seriousness of the situation. "There's nothing we can do to undo what happened," he said slowly. "But we have to handle this carefully. I'm going to speak to the owner. We'll figure out the next steps. We don't want to make things worse." The salesman nodded, barely able to process the gravity of the situation. His mind was filled with thoughts of what might happen next. Would the young man come back? Would the gang get involved? Or was it all over now? He couldn't stop picturing the tattoos, the symbol that had been so familiar but out of place in this context. It had hit him too late, and now he was left to deal with the consequences of his careless behavior. Meanwhile, outside the dealership, the young man was walking down the street, his steps steady and purposeful. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't running from anything. He had made his point. He had shown the salesman his place without raising his voice or resorting to threats. And now he was simply continuing on with his day. There was no drama, no need for more than what had already been done. His calmness, his ability to maintain control in such an intense situation, only served to emphasize the power he had. He wasn't one to flaunt it or make a scene. He didn't need to. His presence alone had been enough to shift the balance. Back in the dealership, the employees continued to whisper quietly among themselves. The reality of the situation was settling in. The young man's actions had sent a clear message, one that no one in that showroom would soon forget. The salesman had made a huge mistake, one that couldn't be ignored. But even more than that, the entire situation had shown the fragile nature of power. One moment, the salesman had felt confident, in control of the situation, and the next, he was reminded just how quickly that control could slip away. The manager was already making plans, but the sense of unease in the showroom was hard to shake. They had all witnessed something powerful unfold, and now there was a quiet tension in the air. No one knew what would happen next, but they were all aware that things would never be the same. For the salesman, there was no way to undo what he had done. The young man had walked away without making a scene, but the truth of the moment had left its mark. The lesson had been clear, and whether he liked it or not, the salesman had learned it the hard way. The showroom had finally settled into an uneasy quiet after the young man left. The employees were scattered, all caught in their own thoughts, unsure of what would happen next. They couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over in their heads. The slap, the young man's calmness, and the realization that they had all witnessed something far beyond an ordinary customer interaction. The salesman was still standing by the counter, his body stiff, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to collect himself. His heart was racing, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the young man's face, the calm expression, the power behind his silence. He hadn't expected this. He had assumed so many things all wrong. Now, all he could think about was how he could possibly make this right. The manager, having spoken to the owner, was now back in the showroom. He approached the salesman slowly, his face serious but not unkind. He could see the fear in the salesman's eyes, the regret that was clearly eating him up inside. "We need to talk," the manager said gently, though his words still carried a sense of urgency. "But first, I think you should sit down. We need to figure out what's next." The salesman nodded without saying anything. His legs felt weak, and he found himself struggling to sit down in one of the chairs. He had never been in a situation like this before, one where his own arrogance and assumptions had led to something much bigger than he could handle. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The weight of it all was starting to feel unbearable. The manager sat down across from him, his voice calm but firm. "I understand you didn't know who he was, but that doesn't excuse your behavior. You have to be more careful in the future, especially with people you don't know. No one is above the consequences of their actions." The salesman nodded again, his eyes on the floor. He couldn't look the manager in the eye. "I messed up. I thought he was just another customer, someone who wouldn't care or notice what I was saying. I never imagined." "I know," the manager interrupted, not unkindly. "But this is something that goes beyond just selling cars. This is about respect. Respect for people, no matter who they are or where they come from. That's what we've lost here." The salesman was quiet for a moment, the weight of the manager's words sinking in. "I didn't mean to disrespect him. I thought I was just doing my job, trying to make a sale. But I got too caught up in thinking I knew what he could afford. I didn't think about the bigger picture. The manager took a deep breath. You weren't thinking. But now, you have to live with the consequences. I spoke to the owner. We're going to address this, but it's going to take time. You need to reflect on what happened here. Outside, the young man was still walking down the street, his pace steady and unhurried. He hadn't rushed out of the dealership, hadn't looked back, and now he was simply going about his day. His actions had been deliberate and controlled, and he knew that the point had been made. He didn't need to cause any more trouble. He had shown the salesman exactly where his assumptions had gone wrong, and that was enough. As the salesman sat in the showroom, still processing everything that had happened, he realized that the young man hadn't done anything extraordinary. He hadn't raised his voice or even made a big scene. He had simply shown that sometimes power lies not in what we say or do, but in how we carry ourselves. The young man had carried himself with such calm authority that it left the salesman with no choice but to face the truth of his actions. The manager stood up, signaling the end of their conversation for now. I want you to take some time to think about what we've talked about, he said. I'm going to handle the rest. But you need to understand that the kind of behavior you showed today doesn't have a place here. We can't afford to make those kinds of mistakes. The salesman nodded quietly, his mind still spinning. He had learned a hard lesson, one he would never forget. The young man had taught him that respect was something that had to be earned, and that assumptions could be dangerous. Now all he could do was wait and see what the consequences would be for his mistake. As the day wore on, the reality of the situation continued to settle in. Everyone in the dealership knew that things had changed, and nothing would be the same again. The power dynamic in the room had shifted in an instant, and the young man's quiet, composed exit had left an impression that would linger far longer than anyone had expected. The following day, the dealership was still feeling the aftereffects of the previous day's incident. The tension from the encounter with the young man lingered in the air, like an unspoken weight that no one could ignore. The salesman had returned to work, but he walked with his head down, trying to keep a low profile. He hadn't said much since he had sat down with the manager. The reality of what had happened seemed to grow heavier the longer he thought about it. His mind was full of questions. What would the young man do next? Was this really over, or was there more to come? The manager, however, had handled things with a level of professionalism the salesman could only admire. He had spoken to the owner, and from what the salesman could gather, they had agreed on a course of action. But even the manager seemed a bit on edge, as if waiting for something, anything, to happen next. The fear of the unknown was what made the atmosphere so tense. No one knew if the young man would come back, or if things would escalate in ways they couldn't predict. But the young man didn't return. Days passed, and still there was no sign of him. The salesman started to wonder if he had misjudged everything. Was the young man truly as important as he seemed? Had he just walked away, leaving the salesman to reflect on his mistake? Or was there something more behind his quiet exit? One afternoon, after several days of uncertainty, the salesman received a phone call. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the number on the screen. It was the manager. Without hesitating, he answered, his voice trembling slightly. "Hello," he said, trying to sound composed, though the anxiety was evident in his tone. "Meet me in my office." The manager's voice came through, firm but calm. "We need to talk." The salesman's stomach twisted in knots. He didn't know what this meeting would be about, but he feared it had something to do with the young man. Maybe the owner had decided to take further action. Maybe the young man had returned with demands. Whatever it was, he knew the moment had arrived. There was no more running from it. When he arrived at the manager's office, he found the door open, and the manager waiting for him inside, a serious expression on his face. "Sit down," the manager said, motioning to the chair in front of his desk. The salesman sat down, his hands fidgeting in his lap. He waited for the words he knew were coming, but when they came, they weren't what he expected. "You're not going to be fired," the manager began, "but you are going to have to work on yourself. We're putting you through a training program to help you understand more about the value of respect and empathy when it comes to customers. We want to make sure something like this never happens again." The relief that washed over the salesman was immediate, but it was mixed with embarrassment. He had feared the worst, that he would be let go, or worse, that the consequences of his actions would be far more serious. But now, all he felt was a deep sense of gratitude, even as he knew the training would be a challenge. The manager continued, his tone softening just a little. "You made a mistake. We all do. But this job is about more than just sales. It's about how we treat people. You need to understand that, and you need to take responsibility for your actions. I want you to learn from this." The salesman nodded, feeling the weight lift off his chest. "I will," he said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes. I won't forget what happened." The manager gave him a nod of approval. "Good. Now there's one more thing I need to mention. The young man, the one you had that encounter with, he's not someone who wants to cause trouble. He's someone who values respect, and he's been more than fair with how he's handled this. You owe him a debt of gratitude, even though you may never see him again." The salesman sat there, reflecting on the manager's words. It was clear that the young man had chosen to walk away, to teach a lesson without seeking revenge or causing a scene. His calmness had left an impression far deeper than any loud confrontation could have, and now the salesman understood that more than ever. As he left the manager's office, the weight of the past week began to settle in. He knew he had a lot of work ahead of him to rebuild his reputation, not just with the young man, but with himself. He had learned the hard way that respect wasn't given, it was earned. And now he would spend every day striving to earn it again, in every interaction, no matter who walked through the door. The young man's lesson had been simple, but it was one that would stay with him for the rest of his life.